I just want to have one quick question I want to get your take on. At Six Nations, our schools are still under federal control. There's only 7 schools in the country that are still controlled by Indian Affairs and 5 of them in our territory. So I just wanted to get your take on where does that put our schools and our education system in relation to this act?
Yeah, that's a good question. So yeah, I am aware of that. So Six Nations is that rare exception. It's not very common, but you're in that exception where there are federally administered schools, not First Nation administered schools. And what happens there, sorry, I did put a bullet in there, and there's a few references in the Act, but just to be brief, what it means is that the Act applies, and the minister has the responsibilities that you would have under the Act. So where the Act says First Nation or First Nations Education Authority, you can read minister. So all of the powers would be the minister's power. Where it says minister, it means minister. Where it says First Nation, it means minister. We can take other questions at this point.
Thank you. National Diaspora Nation has got together last 2 days, and a lot of things that you mentioned there, we already highlighted. We have a lot of experienced educators, and so it didn't cost us a bundle to hear from their perspective. But one question maybe I overlooked, was there be a required number to be designated, to be noted as a school board?
There may be, we don't know yet. So that's one of the areas of where the minister has discretion, and where we will expect more details in the regulations. So there might be more details in the regulations. If not, you might still just hear from it in policy or whatever the minister decides. So it's not stated in the Act, but it's something that the federal government could control under the regulations or under their policies or what the minister decides.
You had mentioned in your presentation that communities that don't have a school located on them, it would be the tuition agreements that would be affected. Can you explain a little bit more how that's going to affect our tuition agreements, and also a little bit on the funding part?
Yeah, so on the tuition agreements, we don't know all of how it will affect you at this point, how it will affect the tuition agreements. In this section, I believe it's 48, that refers to the minister making regulations or cabinet making regulations. One of the things that it says that will be regulated is the conditions under which tuition agreements would be approved by the federal government. So that suggests to me that they're going to set out some rules about when, what I don't know, because we haven't seen the regulations at this point, and we don't know, what they're going to put in their policies or even in the regulations. We don't know yet, but it suggests to me that under this act, they would start saying, I don't really know, maybe what they want to see in tuition agreements, what they're going to pay. There's another section that refers to how the minister will pay what's in a tuition agreement, to that school board, and it does say, I believe, to that entity, like to the province or to the provincial body, the amount that's stated in the agreement, and because there's another section that says it's going to control what conditions must be met in those tuition agreements. It suggests to me that they would set out a whole bunch of requirements that, and if it's not approved, then it's not approved, and then Exactly how that would flow and what it would mean and what those conditions are and what they're going to require, we don't know yet. Sorry, go ahead. That wasn't a very satisfying answer. It's just that we don't know that much yet.
The reason that I was asking about that is because I have a great concern. My community doesn't have a school located in it, and our children go to the public and separate school boards. Now, when you talk about the tuition monies, does that mean that the money then is going to go directly from INAC or whatever it is right to the boards? And if so, my great concern is that we have a large number of children with special needs. And right now, we're able to hire a few education assistants to work with these children. There's nothing in this act that I can read that guarantees that that is going to continue and that the special needs of our children are taken into consideration. Because if the money goes right to the boards, we got no guarantees that they're going to hire our EAs once this is all said and done.
Yeah, sorry, I should correct myself. I'm just double checking, and it does say it would pay to you. It would pay the amount to you, the First Nation or your education authority, but it's going to have control over the amount and the approval of the agreement and so on. So yes, it would be paid to the responsible authority, meaning the First Nation or your education authority. But we don't know what the conditions are going to be on those agreements. And then in terms of the special education question, there's some terms in here that require you to provide access to children with special needs, which is of course many children, and this is a major issue, is failure to, the insufficiency of funding to accommodate children with special needs. All we have now is that there's requirement on you to provide that access, but we don't see the equivalent in the funding.
Okay, now you also mentioned education authorities. We don't have an education authority that handles our tuition agreements. We do that as individual bands.
That's okay, it would go to you.
It still would, okay.
Yeah.
We live in the north, like in the far north. The closest town is about 200, 300 miles away. And what would be, are we going to be compared to that town that's 200, 300 miles away?
It is an excellent question, and absolutely, so in the memo, I raised that point, which is, this idea of provincial comparability. In many ways, it's an improvement on what you have now because the funding you're getting is so low that most of the people that have looked at whether you're getting comparable funding have said, no, you're way below that. It's of course a tricky area, what's comparable and so on. And the point I made earlier is that comparable funding is not enough, right? You're not trying to compare yourself to a province, you're doing your own thing. And you need funding that meets your needs. Certainly the idea of comparability, I think there's a number of First Nations, especially the remote First Nations, there is not a comparable provincial school. There just isn't. This idea of a similar size in a similar geographic region, that doesn't exist. You don't have a comparable provincial school in a similar geographic region, let alone one that's dealing with similar issues to what you deal with. So absolutely, I think that's a valid point, and I can only just recognize that concern.
Just this past year, People for Education did an evaluation of the provincial system, and they found out in the report, the evaluation that they did is that all those small funding formula for the province and its boards are weighted to the big boards. If you live in an area where there's high population, you're gonna get a lot more money than the smaller boards. And so the smaller boards don't get a lot of the same kinds of benefits, financial benefits that larger boards do. And most of our communities are in those areas where you have the smaller boards. So when you start talking about something that's comparable to provincial funding, those areas, those small boards are already underfunded. So it means that we'll already be underfunded if we do a comparison with those.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, the comparative question is a difficult one, and there's been some reports, you know, that NAN, for example, has been involved with. A good one that looks at this question a bit is this report on priority actions in view of improving First Nations education. This is a joint report that NAN did with FINEC in Quebec and FSIN in Saskatchewan, and looked at some issues. And I just pulled up some pages from it, you know, because they did some work looking at what's, you know, they looked at the Ontario formula and Ontario averages, and they said, yes, you know, if we tried to compare as best as we can compare, you know, if we tried to run what a First Nation school would get under the provincial formula, you're well underfunded. But if you look, you know, you really have to look, they look beyond for better comparisons, and again, they're not perfect, but, you know, things like, you know, there's some remote schools in Newfoundland that are, you know, like white schools, let's say, that, you know, they're not accessible by road, and they have to deal with second language issues, so they're like, well, that's a little bit comparative. And those schools get like several times more money than your schools. But again, it's not fully comparative. So the comparative question is very difficult. I looked at a French school, yeah.
Sorry,
Oh, sorry, yeah, and then we'll do your question next, sir.
just really quickly, the three objectives under section 43, fine that they put them in there. Does section 45 make them irrelevant if they pass a budget federally that does not provide enough funding to meet the conditions of 43? Does that absolve them of any liability?
I think it might. I think it could. You know, for me at this point is enough reason to say that that's no good. You know, the advice I would just, the only reason I hesitate, I would say yes. I would say yes, it does take that away. I guess if we were in the point where this bill had passed and was in law, and you came to me then and asked that question, I might say, well, you could try to make an argument. You know, you could try to argue that Section 43 still has value, but I wouldn't risk it. You know, the way I read it, Section 45 just takes out Section 43. That's how I read it. And you could try to make an argument, but it's on a hope and a prayer. You know, I wouldn't want to rest my hopes on that.
I'd just like to make a comment on that. I was up in Ottawa this week at other meetings and at ANSI, and they were talking about, in some discussions, about the additional number of ANSI people that are going to be hired to run this Education Act. And when you look at all the functions of the minister, it's clear there will be thousands of civil servants hired to do this oversight at the same time as your funding is being cut to all your organizations. Because the minister's responsibilities here are enormous, and they're going to have to be implemented by these new civil servants. And also the issue of comparability. I'm at a number of tables with the federal government in different contexts, and comparable does not mean equal. Comparable, even in this context that Judith and Gord were talking about, does not mean equal funding. And the feds are always very careful in the way they word the agreements to use comparable. And we always insist, no, equal based upon an equitable formula. And the feds always say no, comparable, because as Judith said, comparable is So there's no indication here that you will get even comparable funding compared to these other schools in your area. And that federal cap, the amount that cabinet approves, is going to include the amount that's going to have to be put in the budget to pay all these new civil servants in Ottawa and in the provinces. So I think it's a very, very slippery slope, this funding formula. And the regulations that are going to follow are not going to deliver what you're looking for in terms of proper funding for your schools. That funding formula has to be clear and precise, I think, before any legislation goes through.
Chief Gordon Geary, Muscatine First Nation. I'm one of the far north communities. I've listened to this, I've heard about this, I've been advised by my education director, my First Nation teachers regarding the concerns, so it's not something new. I guess what I want to say is, and I want to make it very clear, Sean Aglio, when he resigned, I haven't been happy for a long time. That was the only time this face had a smile. Believe me, I did not support him. I did not give him my vote, and I stated that clearly, that he was betraying his own people. He betrayed us. He became an ally of Stephen Harper. When we had our non-meeting, I stressed that Stephen Harper control of First Nations education. That's what I said. I am not here to listen to this about what it will do to us. We know that. That's why we oppose it. I am 100% in opposition. When there was cutbacks, where was Sean Aglio? It was very quiet as this room. We need a leader at AFN who will represent our concerns, our issues. We are a government. Elders used to say, Ansnabe Okumawan. You know what Ansnabe Okumawan means? They died already. It means First Nation government. We never surrendered, we never ceded. They only answered to one, their creator who placed them here. And yesterday, as I said at non-meeting, I said, what's going on here? French, English, the first language that was heard on this land was our language. French and English are only second language. Why are we being forced? Every one of us here, I'm a survivor of a residential school. Our elders, our communities were subject to oppression where their kids were taken away. It's just a new way of assimilation under that control. So I'm here to give a mandate. What mandate are we going to give Chiefs of Ontario and AFN to begin to speak and oppose and to plan a way to make room for us to continue to teach our children what will help them in tomorrow's life. Nintana just knew with me going to get on get me watch Iron. my parents spoke only First Nation language. They taught me life. I was educated. A child grows up educated from a baby to an adult. The education that is being forced on us, it doesn't help our children. There is suicide, there is confusion, there is lack of housing. We're treated worse than in the third world. Our resources are extracted. We see them going out. I've had enough. What are we going to do, we as leaders? Are we going to continue to allow it? What kind of leaders are we if we allow it? I said yesterday, our voices must be heard. What is the regional chief going to do? What is the executive going to do? I'm tired of regulations, legislation being forced down on us, and it will never work because we're First Nation people. You can't control another nation. When will the Harper government learn that? They tried to assimilate us. It never worked, and it will never work. They will try to tell us that we surrendered the land. No, in each First Nation heart, it burns that we never, this is our land. It is our land. Our young people behind us will suffer like Nelson Mandela did. He will fight, they will fight. Us, it's almost like we became chickens. Every time the government does something, we try to, okay, how will we fit under their regulation policy? No, we tell them, you don't legislate us. You don't bring down your policies on us. I want to hear, what are we going to do? What are we going to tell the Harper government? Now that Sean Atkey is gone, who is going to speak for us? That's what I want to hear. I want a clear mandate coming from this assembly. I don't want to talk about how I'm going to fit in there.
Just to respond, thanks so much for your comments. I think that's absolutely right, and Regional Chief Beardy wants to comment. Obviously, a lot of this is old news. Many of you know what's wrong with Bill C-33, and this was, I think, just provided as a resource. Regional Chief has already spoken out against it, and your leadership in the education portfolio, Grand Chief Pierce has spoken out. Many of you have spoken out against it. That bigger question of what you want to bring forward, that's going to be your question, right? So, thanks so much for focusing on that issue. Regional Chief, did you want to make a comment? That will be the focus of the remainder of the summit.
Thank you very much. I'd like to just comment on the Chief Beardy from Muscat's call for action. I am a regional chief of Ontario, and I get a mandate from Chiefs Assembly. That's why the portfolio holder for education, Grand Chief Peters, and myself, and the PC executive called you together, because we need direction. You need to tell us where we go from here. There are provisions with within the AFA charter
The Confederacy of Nations can be called on emergency basis to deal with national issues. The executive of BC Ontario issued 2 letters calling for that. One on May 1st, it went right across Canada to every First Nation. Second one, May 2nd, again calling all First Nation leaders to come together and take a position, a statement regarding what's before us. So that's what we're going to look for this afternoon. We need solid direction. We need to tell us, yes, that's where we need to go. The executive of PCI work with in Ontario, the Grand Chiefs. We're still pushing for an emergency session at the national level to debate and come up with directions, some concrete directions where we need to go with this. There is a slate passed right now by the federal government. We don't know how long that's going to last. It may be left tomorrow or next week. We need to come together as soon as possible, and we cannot do it unless we get that direction from yourselves, and we're hoping to get that here today and tomorrow. We're still pushing for that. There has to be a voice, there has to be a national voice coming together from the leaders across Canada. So I just want to share that with you. That is why we are here. We need action going forward. Thanks.
Thank you, Jimmy Rich. I'm beginning to think this is all an illusion. We talk about illusion. I wanted to talk about the, on your presentation, you said the Crown's view. I would like to know what your interpretation means. To me, it seems incomplete. We talk about they believe. I need answers on that. How do you answer this? And on the flip side, we talk about Section 35. We're looking at the Charlottetown Accord. We talk about inherent right was explicit and recognized in the Charlottetown Accord, Section 35. And what do you mean by treaty renewal? And what is the Crown's view? Because you talk about a fundamental disconnect here. And everything seems to boil down, when I see it, you talk about the minister. Everything boils down to the minister. I also want to read something here. This is my interpretation of how all the governments see us, including judges, and I think a lot of chiefs have this. It says here, this is from Justice Fraser, the problem is we are dealing with a number of dysfunctional communities. The mess, in my view, has to be dealt with by the First Nations communities who may be recognizing that there is no sense in having people live in the middle of nowhere with nothing to do. Children have no reason to go to school because they know there is no point. People cope with their frustration and idleness by drinking too much, and all the little tin pot chiefs and councillors who take advantage of our current system have no interest in changing it because they benefit from it. That is so wrong. I am a chief. What we're talking about today is a lifeline. We talk about Charlottetown Accord. The illusion presented to the people and the general public, that's what it is. But to the people sitting here, it's not an illusion. We are standing on our feet. Those are our fundamental rights under treaty, which government fails to recognize, and they're doing a darn good job at making the public believe we live off the coffers of the government, federal, provincial legislation. And yet, where does that leave us? But I believe our backs are against the wall. We cannot allow this to happen. The First Nations territories, across this great land, our homelands, too many people, First Nations children falling through the cracks, and yet they say on the media, they give us enough money. That is untrue. We all know this fact. We know this over and over. It's the same old story, same rhetoric, over and over. And yet the public is deceived. And yet, where does that leave us? I think in my community, we are doing the darnest to survive as a nation. and what the regional chief said, no more will there be. I'm looking for action, direct action, because I cannot let this happen to my children. All the chiefs sitting here, elders, you're talking about my people, where I come from. Their future, their lifeline is in your hands. Why I say this, I'm looking for words that are going to give direction and action that's going to make this thing move. We cannot allow this to happen. Because to me, my interpretation is when we do this, federal, provincial, this is going to elaborately boil down to total and full control of First Nation school, which in general is going to be close the books, no more school. Because nowhere does it say in there, there is shunya for language, culture. However, they do imply there's money for English, French. Now, why should my children learn French when they should learn their own language first? Kangi kinishtutan nasab ninwin. I am a proud Anishinaabe, where I come from. I was told keep your head high. And how can you keep your head high when the government and the system tells our people we are not worthy, we are third world citizens people in our own homelands? When our people fall through the cracks, statistically speaking, in our First Nations, we all know this. Harper will not address the missing and murdered woman. If that was white woman, there would be a public outcry that you have never seen before. But it's only Native women. And this is an atrocity to First Nations across this land. What about the residential school? This all applies to everything we talk about from day one. When they put their education system in our schools, that was not to educate. That was to eradicate, assimilate, to remove language, culture, everything, to take the Anishinaabe out of the Anishinaabe, just to make us as white as this page. That is an assault on our people. Our people are dying. This I know. We know this. Does Harper government really care? I don't think so. As long as there are Anishinaabes, they want. In Northern Ontario, where I come from, they want what is under the ground, resources, to extract not only the resources from the mining, logging, they want to extract and remove. And that's the same thing I believe they're going to do to Anishinaabe. Try to extract, remove, assimilate, and put us into a society that's not ours. Our people need the dynamics and the fire from the chiefs to make them believe our youth are being heard. Our elders are not forgotten, that their prayers are still alive. That fire needs to be ignited in all nations, in that spirit of unity that we call. Because I speak not for myself, but for my children. My grandchildren, I can't even see them yet because I'm busy at meetings. But I believe we're on the same parallel, on the same path to fight this government. We cannot allow this to happen, and I concur with Chief Gordon Beatty said. One man can do this, to take away Anishinaabe way to go sit with Harper administration. But there's another man or woman that's going to rise and lead people to fight and sit in the government. No more, no more. This is our homeland. We belong here, the first people. No more to sign on the dotted line until the true interpretation is understood. Front and back, left and right. The legal dynamics are going to be explained better, because today we know more, as what you're saying in your papers. We understand what this is about today. Our forefathers, unfortunately, sometimes they got swindled so good. I'll give you a good example. My grandfather, he said, "Sheriff, come to visit me." He bring brown envelope. I sign it, he said. "Is your name Walter Navio?" My Muslim said. "Yes," he said. He could only read and write. I'm named after him. He told me all this in my language. 8 months later, I believe I went to visit back in my First Nations. I got brown envelope saying that I was divorced. There you go. He walked away. And I see how my treaty was signed in 1905 with Matawai First Nations with X's, witnessed by. That was not the real intent. The intent was based on a fundamental of lies, to gagamutin, to steal it, everything from our people. It was not only land, it was to take the spirit of the people, to rob them of their culture, of who we are as a nation of people. And it's time, I believe, when your back is against the wall, what do you do as moms and kukums to protect your children? You're going to stand up. And today, I say this, we've had enough. We have to tell the rest of Canada and the world. We talk about apartheid, Mandela, Tutu Desmond. We have to stand on the foundation of our forefathers. That is a good life. Mama and Nuki went to work together as a nation under the direction of elders, their teachings, which Creator gave us. And I want answers to what I just talked about there. How do we talk this? What you mean by treaty renewal? How should we wish?
Amen, Chief. Well, all I can say is that your political vision, that's treaty renewal. Political vision that you just put out there, and there's a solid legal base for that political vision. And that legal base has to come to expression in what you decide to do politically about this act and about implementing all of your treaty rights. So I can only say amen, amen, amen. That's what we need, your political vision to be implemented. And as I say, it has a very strong legal base in how we analyze Section 35, and that is your recognition for implementing that vision.
Bonjour, good morning. Geez, it's always hard to speak after these two guys, and others like them. So I'm not going to try to, they refer to that as kissing with the dogs, because it's going to be pretty tough after that. But on that note, I'd just like to ask you to turn your attention to the corner, that guy's sitting in the corner over here. Hey, see him? Actually, he's operating a device that is actually opening up the door to this meeting to friends across this country, but also foe. And it also suggests at this point in time that we do need to appropriately deal with the issues at hand. What I mean by that is I looked at the agenda here this morning and realizing what the chief indicated here, both of them, they said that we need to respond. But I think we need to be mindful of the mandate of this meeting. It's twofold. One is to get a really good understanding of what we're dealing with. The other one is the process. And I want to suggest that if we can, Ontario Regional Chief, we do need to appropriately afford the time and the proper space to discuss these particular issues around strategy and what we're doing. We know that the AFN right now is not in a good way. We know that the AFN has really a litany of missteps on this issue. And we know that with the resignation of the National Chief, there has to be a very careful response to the issue of how we ensure this process goes forward. So if we can have you and your colleagues speak to the agenda and in how we're going to afford the time today, there is no time to wait. We have to respond accordingly. I also want to acknowledge respectfully the territory, the chiefs, the elders, but I want to acknowledge the lady that spoke, the elder, and the prayer that was provided here for us. And if you listen to what she said that her parents and grandparents told her, never forget who you are, where you come from, never forget your identity. But she also said something key. She said, Your work is to always work towards the Creator. One thing that we must understand here is, with all this noise and all of the complexities around this legislation, there's one simple tenet that exists here.
Go ahead. Good.
Our children, when they were born with sovereignty. That's very distinctly different from Canadians. That sovereignty exists. It was not relinquished, it was not taken away. The treaties did not give that away. We are not a conquered people. So at the root of what we're dealing with here, we need to make the proper moves to ensure that what this infringement, this imposition of legislation doesn't do is say we're giving away that sovereignty, our right to First Nation jurisdiction. And what the legal opinion is saying if we go down this road, we're endorsing what they so-called legal infringement on our people. We can't do that. We have to oppose this through and through and through and through. Just an observation here on the legal opinion. I again want to acknowledge the work of the Ontario Regional Chief, our portfolio, and all of our technicians that are helping us navigate and understand this better. But there was a question raised here earlier that I would ask the legal folks to put some thought around, as well as our portfolio holder. But it's a question around, what about those communities that don't have on-reserve schools? I think what's happened here, folks, and it's happened within our own territory, the Anishinaabe Nation, regarding our own negotiations, is that those that are not involved and who are not dealing with on-reserve schools are somewhat oblivious to the impacts of this legislation. And it's because we're not affording the opportunity to look deeper at what this is doing overall with respect to termination, with respect to not respecting Aboriginal treaty rights, the inherent right to education. So I would ask that what we do here going forward, and there are a lot of people watching this right now, this is not just about on-reserve here, folks. This is about all First Nations. This is about the right to education for every First Nation child across this country. So let's be clear here. There's a lot more at stake. I think what the legal opinion does is it gives us a good starting point. But what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to look at this a little deeper. But I would also ask that the organizers of this event speak to the issue of process, and we need an answer today. I think the chiefs want to deal with where we go next, so I'll just offer those comments. Miigwech. Thank you.
This is a matter of process, first of all. We drafted this agenda and we went and we asked for a legal opinion on this particular issue. We wanted to get a legal opinion because we didn't want to have a debate about our opinion. What I would say, what somebody else would say. We asked for an independent party to come in and do a legal opinion so that we would be able to see very clearly what all those areas are. Some of the areas we didn't even think about were identified in the process that's taking place. So that's our first process today, was being able to get some basic information to each other, work with the information that was there. Our notion of being able to put that information out to anybody who was watching was critical, because most people, as we heard this morning, in particular the media, do not understand the depth of this issue that we're dealing with. Our citizens and our supporters will have access to listen. They will have an opportunity to see the discussion that's going on. They will see the legal opinions that are being presented. We wanted to try to deal with the funding matter too as well. And then we're going to close off the webcast this afternoon so that we can begin our own internal discussions about what we feel we need to be able to do. And that's the critical part of this whole discussion, is about what we're going to do. Because we already know what people out there want us to do. Question remains, what are we going to do about it? And so we've taken certain actions right now to ensure that there's a national voice. We're moving ahead on the Confederacy. The Confederacy will take place on March 14th, as we indicated earlier, and that will be our first national voice on this matter. I very clearly think that we were pushed aside on purpose, that the leadership was pushed aside on purpose so that there would be no national debate and the legislation would pass. And now we're in a place where we have to ensure that that national debate goes forward, and we also have to ensure that we're able to tell this government exactly what it is that we want. And so this afternoon, that will be our discussion. I was hopeful that we're going to be able to continue this morning with the funding process, and I need to be able to see some show of hands. You want to continue on just to be able to go through the funding, the dollars part of it, and be able to see what the funding looks like? I need some indication if we want to do that. Yes? Enough people say yes? We'll do the funding then, and then we'll shut it off, we'll have lunch, and then we come back this afternoon, we will begin our discussions about what we want, and we'll turn off the webcast so it's an internal discussion.
Very brief, nice funding. Some additional comments? Yes, the way this was set up is that I think it's really important to try to understand exactly what contains within this act, so that when we begin to formulate our strategies, our plan, that we have good understandings and basis going forward. In terms of those letters I was talking about earlier, the ones I said we sent out from COO on May 1st and May 2nd, it was a letter that I sent to the executive, which I'm part of, but mainly addressed to the national chief before he resigned. It was a request to the national chief with support of the AFN executive to call an emergency Confederacy of Nations meeting to allow the leadership to debate on this bill. Yes, the AFN executive, the national chief got a mandate in December with 5 conditions on it to negotiate and talk to the government. But what was missing, being part of AFN executive, what was missing in my mind is that he should have come back to the chiefs and said, this is what I was able to negotiate from the government. What do you think? Where do we go from there? I don't think that resolution gave the AFN executive a full mandate just to go ahead and begin to accept what is on the table. So being part of the executive, myself being part of the AFN executive, I worked with Ontario Executive PC, the Grand Chiefs, to request a national forum for chiefs, the leaders, to debate on this issue so that there's be a response that needs to come out. If we have problems with it, then we should say that. And we should also offer alternatives. What is it that we want? So that's what we're trying to do here. We're not trying to rush you. We're trying to inform everybody so that we all have the same understanding what the bill says, what it actually says. Does it control First Nation control of education, or does it take further erode that? So that is the way this has been set up. So as we said, we will continue to push for emergency national chiefs gathering May 1st based on the charter. And the charter says 5 regions. If 5 regions accept that and support that with 50%, where the number is based on 1 rep for every 10,000, we will go forward to that, and that's what we like to do. So we need your support, but at the same time, we need your strategies. What is it exactly that we're going to take forward? Nigash.
Okay, so at your request, I'm just going to run through the funding that the federal government had announced would accompany the act. Back on February 7th, as I'm sure many of you recall, there was that announcement about the act. We had not seen the act at that time, but there was an announcement about funding associated with it that was made at that time. It was done as a press release And as far as I've seen, that's the only information that there is right now. Certainly I haven't seen anything else, so the information I'll discuss today will be based on that press release of February 7th. It's not a lot of information. It was, it was very kind of minimal information at that time. What I did at that time was try to look at that and try to figure out how much is that really? What kind of a difference would that make in First Nations education? Just try to dig behind those numbers a bit. I posted a blog about that at the time, and it's still available. If you Google OKT blog, or my name, I'm sure it'll come up. So I'm just going to run through that briefly, just to give a sense about the money that was announced by the minister to be associated with the act. In short, what I had found, just digging behind those numbers a little bit, is first of all, I think it's important to say you need a lot more money in your education system. So certainly more money is positive in a certain sense. And you wouldn't want to lose out on the money that was announced. You want to try to find, I think it would be worthwhile to discuss finding a way to keep that and potentially more on the table. Because you don't want to, you don't want this act, but you do want and have been advocating for many, many years for more funding for your education system. When I dug behind the numbers that were announced, what I found out was, it looked to me, assuming that was additional money, and it wasn't quite clear that it would be additional money, but I think that that's what they were announcing. I can't be totally sure. So on the basis that it was additional money, it looked like it would improve things a bit. But it looked to me, and I'll get into this in a minute, it's quite a ways off from what I know based on the reports that you've developed. It's a ways off from that. So I didn't do any new research. I am not, I'm not an economist. I'm not, I didn't do any kind of new research into the needs of your education systems or anything like that. I just took a look at the reports that you've already developed. There's been some reports previously done in Ontario, in other provinces, some by AFN as well, earlier reports. And just took a look at, where that lined up, as well as reports that have been done by other people. For example, the Parliamentary Budget Office, they take a look at things. They had looked at, for example, the school infrastructure needs. There's been reports by the Auditor General looking at things. So I just took a look at, what's those available reports. I was familiar with a lot of those already following the education issue, and just tried to look at the numbers. Just briefly, they announced overall $1.9 billion in funding. Again, I'm going to assume that's new funding, but it's not clear. It's a pretty misleading figure because that's spread out over a number of years. So, sure, one could say, what's the total amount that might be spent on education over 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 or 20 years? You're going to get into bigger figures. But it doesn't really help you have an informed conversation. So the first thing that, of course, I had to do was just break that down by year. But it's a bit different for each piece of it. So I'll go by piece. One piece was infrastructure funding. They announced $500 million over 7 years. So you break that down, that's about $71.5 million per year. Let's assume that that's new funding. Sorry, I don't have slides because I didn't know that we wanted to go over this today, but we'll just have to do our best. So you can, just to get a sense, the current spending on infrastructure is about, for First Nations education, about $200 million a year. So you try, you can picture the number 200 million. It would be adding 70-ish on top of that. Okay, that's that's a chunk of a raise. So you'd be going, in theory, nationally from 200 million to 271 million. But the Parliamentary Budget Office, so that's Canada's own, office looking at federal spending. A few years ago, back in 2009-ish, they looked at what was needed just to bring the existing schools up to standards. And they didn't have all the information, but based on the information they knew, you needed about 410 million a year as of 2009, 2010. So we were looking at, and I don't have all the information again, but from what those reports say, you've got about 200, this would bring it overall to about 271. What you needed, even back a few years ago, just for existing schools, looking at estimated about 410. So it just suggests that, sure, increasing that money for infrastructure is a good start, but that's still a large way off, in the realm of maybe half of what you would need to bring existing schools up to standards. And that doesn't include new schools. Many of you don't have schools in your communities and wish to have schools in your communities. So that isn't included in that figure at all. Another thing that was announced was that there would be, the 2% cap would end, and there would be a new escalator on the base funding. And it said that escalator, the way I read the announcement is that it would go up to 4.5%. I've heard some other comments about that. Again, without seeing more details, it's hard to say for sure, but certainly the way I read the announcement was suggested to me that they were saying 4.5%. Sounded to me like a new cap. It would go up to 4.5%. Again, without seeing more details, it's really hard to say for sure, but that's how it seemed to me when I read that announcement. What's I think important to state is that from what I know, and what I've looked in a bit into the history of First Nations education funding as well, is you've never been properly funded. So, back from when you first started administering schools on reserve following, getting out of the residential school system, Canada devolved, some of that administration cost to you, and it was, just as just as it often is today, it was quite determined not to increase costs in doing so. There was never an attempt, as far as I'm aware of, to try to match provincial funding or try to figure out what you really need. They just started setting figures, I think, based on prior figures or whatever, again, it's that budgetary political process. The federal government decides this is what we feel like spending on First Nations education. There's no comparison, no needs-based analysis that's really driving it. And that's entrenched very low levels of funding over time. In 1995, of course, a cap on the growth of that was implemented, and that set you even further behind. Economists have said that in real terms, like when you look at inflation, your funding has actually decreased over the years. The numbers have increased, but when you take into account that costs go up, it's actually decreasing. But it's important to know, like, you weren't decreasing from some good level of funding in 1994. You were decreasing from a bad level of funding, a low level that was never designed to meet your needs or even to be equitable. And then it started going down from there. So people have done estimates of what you've lost due to that 2% cap, but that does not represent the full extent of the gap. That 2% cap is only part of the gap. There's much more than that to bring your systems up to equitable and needs-based funding. What kind of annual escalation of funds do you really need? I mean, certainly my advice would be, well, you should look at what are the actual escalating costs, right? Which are driven by, of course, the numbers of students and inflation, for one thing. And, some other people have looked at, what that might be, and certainly population growth, some have said, is more, at least in some communities, more than 4.5%. So that alone, a 4.5% is not going to be enough, it looks like, based on what others have said, to cover both inflation and population growth. I looked at an older AFN report that said, averaged out population growth and inflation, and said that was, in the last few years, that has come to 6.3%. So that was where they added it up. added it up, and just, you know, looking at those two figures, it seemed to me, sure, 4.5%, it's better than 2, got to acknowledge that. Would be an improvement. Would it get you to where your real annual costs are growing? It, you know, from what other people have looked at, it didn't look like it. Okay, there's 2 more pieces there. One is the core funding, of course. That's the main piece of funding. That's the part that would be growing each year. And they announced $1.25 billion in that core funding, not beginning for another 2 years, of course. Then that $1.25 billion is over 3 years. So we got to first of all say, what is that each year? It's a bit over 400 million. Or, you know, you just do the math, divide by 3, 417 million per year. Let's assume it's new funding, though it's not totally clear. What's the core funding now? It's about $1.5 billion. So if you can just try to get a mental picture, 1.55, just over $1.5 billion, add another 400 million, gets you close, about a 25% increase, gets you close to about $2 billion, you know, from 1.5 to 2. If that's new money, if that's what it is. When it would kick in a couple years. But again, as I mentioned, we don't really know what's the full extent of what is needed to bring that core funding up to equity and up to what you really need. And that's a difficult question, and you know, I looked at a number of reports. I'm not aware of something that really looks at that. You know, what's the national figure for all of that? You know, if you applied a needs-based funding or a really good kind of equitable funding formula across the country, you know, what's the difference between that and your current funding? There's been some local comparisons, and a number of good reports have been done. I linked to a number of reports in that blog that you can check out. Again, there's one that I mentioned there that Nan was involved in, and it finds some, you know, pretty serious gaps. You know, looking at, I'm just, you know, eyeballing this, but it's looking at, you know, a third underfunded. Just looking at Ontario comparisons, getting into a half underfunded, depending on how you look at different, you know, numbers in the comparisons and different factors. And then when they were looking at, you know, well, they realized, like, as some of our delegates here and chiefs said, there is no comparator funding to many NAN schools in Ontario. So if we look outside Ontario to some, you know, francophone second language, you know, remote schools that are non-First Nations, there's not a lot of those in Canada. Then you're looking at, you know, funding needs to increase maybe 3 times. And again, these are rough comparisons. That's not even a needs-based, what do you really need to meet your needs kind of formula. So are we seeing funding increase by, you know, a third, double, triple? You know, no, we're not seeing that. There had been a document that was done by the AFN a few years ago that said the annual gap just from the 2% cap was $745 million a year. And this would be 400-ish million a year in new funding. So it's not even covering the difference of what you've lost in the cap. But again, as I said, the cap is not the full problem here. So I do not have a full, you know, I didn't want to run new reports and analysis. It's not really my my strength. But I just wanted to take a look at some of those existing figures, and again, it seemed to me that while new funding is certainly good, and I'm sure could be put to a lot of good use in your communities, I wouldn't suggest that, I wouldn't want anyone, I didn't think it was good to suggest that this would close the gap, because certainly based on the information I've seen, it didn't look that way. And the final piece of funding that was announced was implementation funding, which was a 4-year package, which would come out to about $40 million a year nationally. That's pretty small for implementation. And considering that, one of the main issues that's been well documented is that First Nations are not really being funded to establish much of a system in education. You have some funding for schools, per student, but, the supports, the organizations that you've been trying to establish, the governance question, fulfilling roles that in other systems, a school board, as well as a ministry, and other players in the education, system would provide. You're really not getting much in the way of support for that at all, and no surprise that means that you've had much difficulty trying to build those systems. You have accomplished a lot nevertheless, but there's much to be done there. This amount is extremely low. I mean, if you break it down for First Nation, it would be about $63,000 per First Nation. I mean, maybe you could hire one other person, maybe, with that. That's not really going to support your education systems at a governance level in any dramatic new way. So, I just that's the breakdown of the numbers, the way I had done it when I wrote that blog at the time. I don't pretend to be an authority on this, I really don't. I just wanted to dig behind it and try to, fact check some of what was being announced about the funding. And, again, just to sum up, where, from reading the reports that you've done and others have done, it seems very clear to me that you are very dramatically underfunded and that you need quite a bit more funding. New funding being announced is a positive in that sense, and I recognize that, but I think you're well within your rights to be fighting for quite a lot more funding than that announcement. Are there questions about that particular piece before we break for lunch?
Thank you, Judith. I do want to thank Judith and John for their presentation this morning. I think it highlights for us the degree of control that the federal government wants to take over our education. And, I can say that at first blush of this legislation, when we sent it out to the communities, our assessment was never met the 5 conditions that was set out. It didn't meet those. But when you get into the details, you find out so much more of what it doesn't do and what it bestows upon the minister and what it does to everything that exists in our communities right now that we work so hard to be able to build. So I do want to thank them for their presentations. They'll be here this afternoon with us in the course of our discussions. Right now, we're going to have our lunch. I see Mr. Mr. Hare is going to do our food for us today. We'll ask for our food.
Avdek miłeś, panie Witkeli, czego istnieje. I mamy debatę mężczyzn, da będziemy na niebie insetta mod, mamy to chyba drzewa. I też nam miłeś czekali, właśnie, i ga kobe model. Spare one of those. Binge jadek, właśnie, nasz będę czego rozpewek. Geno mat do niby na, kiwy się na nowo istnieje. Matino be matchek, was be bayatek, kadeo. I go wabijo. Kine rish number says the Matino number meeting. Rish number is was said, not in any change in that. He got trick kidding. The Mati don't want the new. He got posted to never get done. They know he's not with the not to be way from his share. We got just like that out of the bench.